What was meant to be a swift naval victory turned into a months-long bloodbath on a forgotten beach, all for a strategic goal that was never even achieved. This is the story of the Gallipoli Campaign. To understand why the Gallipoli Campaign even happened, you need to picture the world in 1915. The First World War had already locked Europe into trench warfare. The Western Front stretched from Belgium through France, and millions of men were pinned down in a brutal stalemate, and allies Britain, France, and Russian needed a way to break it. Russia, in particular, was in trouble. Cut off from easy supply lines, it was running short of weapons, ammunition, and food. If the Allies could open a sea route through the Dardanelles Strait, they could reach Russia, strengthen their eastern front, and maybe even force Germany to fight on two major fronts without respite. The Dardanelles Strait was a narrow stretch of water in modern-day Turkey. It connected the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and ultimately to Constantinople, the Ottoman capital. Control that waterway, and you cut the Ottoman Empire in half. More importantly, you opened a direct line of supply and communication with Russia. The idea made sense on paper, but on paper is where it should have stayed. The plan came from Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, essentially the civilian head of the Royal Navy. Churchill was ambitious, energetic, and convinced that bold moves could change the course of the war. He believed that by sending a fleet of battleships to bombard Ottoman forts along the Dardanelles, the Allies could sail straight through to Constantinople, terrify the Ottomans into surrender, and strike a blow that would echo through the entire war. It would also, he thought, impress neutral countries like Greece and Bulgaria, and maybe even bring them into the Allied camp. But there were problems right from the start. Vessels that were already outdated compared to the modern dreadnoughts, the Admiralty saw them as expendable, so why not use them to smash through Ottoman defenses? And poorly suited for a high-risk mission in narrow waters lined with coastal artillery. Easily defended passage-in, the gamble already looked reckless. Think of it like trying to storm a locked house by driving an old car through the front door while the homeowner waits inside with a shotgun. Even if you make it through the first room, there's no guarantee the rest of the house won't stop you cold. That was the flaw of the Dardanelles plan. It underestimated the Ottomans, overestimated the firepower of the Allied fleet, and ignored the terrain. The naval assault began in February 1915. Allied battleships pounded the Ottoman forts lining the strait. And at first, it seemed like the plan might work. Reports came in that some of the Turkish guns were silenced. But the Ottomans, with German military advisors, had prepared well. They had laid minefields in the narrow waters. They had reinforced their coastal defenses. And they had troops ready to fight to the last. On March 18th, the Allies launched their big naval attack. 18 battleships steamed into the strait. At first, the bombardment seemed effective, but then disaster struck. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine and sank within minutes, taking hundreds of men with her. The British ships Irresistible and Ocean followed soon after, sinking or crippling under the combined assault of mines and artillery. In a single day, the Allies lost 3 battleships and had several more badly damaged. The attack collapsed. It was a humiliating failure. Churchill had promised a quick naval victory. Instead, the Allies had lost ships, men, and the element of surprise. At this point, the Allies shifted from a purely naval plan to a full-scale invasion. If they couldn't force the strait with ships alone, they would land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula, seize the high ground, and then silence the forts from land. Only then could the fleet push through to Constantinople. The Allies had not planned for a ground invasion from the beginning. They were improvising, and improvisation in war often leads to disaster. The job of the invasion fell to the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, led by General Sir Ian Hamilton. The force included British and French troops, along with soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the Enza Ace. The plan was simple enough in theory. Troops would land at several points on the Gallipoli Peninsula, secure beachheads, and then push inland to capture the forts. But simple in theory often translates to impossible in practice. The beaches were narrow, with steep cliffs and ridges rising above them. The Ottomans, commanded by capable officers like Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, known as Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, had the advantage of high ground. And once again, the Allies underestimated their enemy. They believed the Ottomans would fold under pressure. They were wrong. When the landings began on April 25, 1915, they quickly turned into chaos. At Cape Helles, British troops tried to come ashore. Under heavy machine gun fire, they were cut down in the water, on the sand, and against the wire. At ANZ Cove, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at the wrong spot, finding themselves at the base of steep cliffs instead of flatter ground. They clawed their way up, but the Ottomans rained down bullets and artillery shells. The beaches became slaughterhouses. What was supposed to be a quick strike turned into a siege. The Allies dug trenches, the Ottomans dug their own, and the two sides stared at each other across narrow strips of no man's land. The Gallipoli Peninsula began to look just like the Western Front, only hotter, dustier, and with worse supplies. Disease, flies, and heat stroke killed as many men as bullets. Water was scarce, rations were poor, and the stench of rotting corpses filled the air. Soldiers who had come expecting a swift victory now found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The Gallipoli Campaign dragged on for months. Every new Allied offensive failed to break the Ottoman lines. Each attack cost thousands of lives, often for only a few yards of ground. By the end of 1915, it was clear the campaign was doomed. In January 1916, the Allies evacuated the peninsula. It was the one part of the operation that went smoothly. Not a single man was lost during the withdrawal. But by then, the damage was done. Gallipoli had cost the Allies over 250,000 casualties. The Ottomans suffered similar losses, and what had been achieved, nothing. Constantinople remained in Ottoman hands. The Dardanelles remained closed. Russia remained cut off. All the lives lost had been for a strategic goal that was never reached. And the blame, much of it fell on Winston Churchill. He was forced to resign from his Admiralty post, his career nearly destroyed by the failure. For the Australians and New Zealanders, Gallipoli became a national trauma. Remembered every year on Anzac Day for the Ottomans, it was a rare and glorious victory in a war that would otherwise destroy their empire. And for history, it was a lesson in how arrogance, poor planning, and underestimating your enemy can turn a bold idea into a disaster. This was part 1 of the Gallipoli series, and we'll be diving deeper into the battles, the soldiers' experiences, and the lasting legacy of this campaign. If you're enjoying this breakdown of history's biggest blunders, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian so you don't miss the next part. The Gallipoli campaign was supposed to begin with a show of overwhelming naval power. The Allies believed their fleets could smash their way through the Dardanelles Strait, silence the Ottoman forts, and sail straight into Constantinople. The idea was simple. Use the might of the Royal Navy, backed by French ships, to open the way for Russia and deal a devastating blow to the Ottoman Empire. But what actually unfolded in March 1915 was nothing short of a naval disaster. The Dardanelles Strait was the key to the plan. It was a narrow stretch of water, twisting and turning, lined on both sides by cliffs and ridges where Ottoman guns could be placed. To picture it, imagine trying to row a boat down a thin canyon, while someone sits high above on the walls with rifles and cannons. Every ship passing through was an easy target. Worse, the strait had been seeded with mines, hidden just below the surface, waiting to tear the hulls of warships apart. Winston Churchill and the British Admiralty thought these obstacles could be overcome with sheer force. The fleet assembled for the assault was impressive on paper 18 battleships, along with cruisers, destroyers, and minesweepers. Many of the battleships, however, were older vessels, relics compared to the newer dreadnoughts. These ships were considered expendable, but that didn't make them any less vulnerable. They were slower, less armored, and less suited for the task of forcing a narrow, hostile waterway. On paper, the Allies had another advantage. Numbers, the Ottoman Empire was seen as a sick man, a fading power that couldn't stand against Britain and France. What the Allies failed to account for was German involvement. German officers, especially Admiral Wilhelm Suchen, had taken control of Ottoman naval planning and helped fortify the strait. They set up minefields, coordinated artillery positions, and ensured the Ottoman gunners were drilled and ready. Far from being weak, the defenses of the Dardanelles were among the strongest in the world. The first bombardments began in February 1915. Allied ships shelled the forts along the strait, firing heavy shells that tore into stone walls and emplacements. Reports suggested that some of the guns had been silenced, and this gave Churchill hope that the final push would work. But appearances were deceiving. Many of the Ottoman guns were dug in or camouflaged. Others could be quickly repaired. The mines remained untouched, and sweeping them was proving nearly impossible. The minesweepers the Allies brought were not military ships. They were actually civilian trawlers fishing, boats manned by crews who were not trained for combat. They tried to clear paths through the minefields at night, but every attempt was met with fierce Ottoman fire from the shore. Imagine being in a small wooden fishing vessel, trying to drag heavy cables through the water to snag mines, while shells and bullets rained down from the cliffs above. The crews often fled before completing their work, and the minefields stayed in place. On March 18, 1915, the Allies launched their grand assault. The plan was to send in the largest battleships to smash the forts and push through the strait. The British and French ships steamed forward in formation, their guns thundering. For a moment, it seemed the strategy might succeed. The heavy bombardment shook the forts, and some Ottoman gunners abandoned their posts. But then the mines did their work. The French battleship Bouvet struck one and capsized within minutes. Nearly the entire crew, over 600 men, went down with the ship. The water boiled with debris, oil, and bodies. The sight shook the fleet, but the attack continued. Soon after, the British battleship Irresistible hit another mine. She lost power and began to drift helplessly under the guns of the shore batteries. A rescue attempt was launched, but it only made the situation more chaotic. The Ocean, another British battleship, tried to assist, but also struck a mine. By the end of the day, 3 battleships were sunk, 3 more badly damaged, and the rest of the fleet was in retreat. The cost was staggering, not just in lives and ships, but in morale. The Allies had gone into the Dardanelles confident, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they had been bloodied and humiliated by an enemy they thought weak. The naval assault had been billed as a turning point in the war. Instead, it became a symbol of Allied arrogance and poor planning. The disaster highlighted just how unprepared the Allies were for the defenses they faced. The minefields had not been cleared, the artillery had not been neutralized, and the narrow geography of the strait meant that every ship was exposed. The losses made it clear that a naval-only strategy would not succeed. Yet Churchill and others could not simply walk away. Too much had been invested, and the political cost of admitting failure was unthinkable. So, the plan changed. If the strait couldn't be forced by ships alone, then soldiers would have to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, take the high ground, and silence the Ottoman forts from the land. Only then could the fleet move forward. This decision set the stage for one of the bloodiest and most futile campaigns of the entire war. For the men who had survived the naval fiasco, the memory of March 18th was burned into their minds. Sailors described seeing the Bouvet roll over in less than 2 minutes, giving almost no time for lifeboats to launch. Survivors clung to wreckage as oil and fire spread across the water. The loss of the Irresistible was equally haunting, with men abandoning ship under relentless bombardment, only to be pulled from the water, half dead with exhaustion. These were not clean, honorable battles. They were massacres at sea. To make matters worse, the failure of the naval assault gave the Ottomans confidence. Mustafa Kemal, then a rising officer in the Ottoman army, famously declared to his men that they would defend the homeland to the death. The defenders dug in even deeper, preparing for the landings they knew were coming. Every delay gave them more time to strengthen their defenses. The Gallipoli naval assault has often been compared to slamming your head against a brick wall. The Allies thought they could batter their way through with brute force, but all they achieved was self-inflicted damage. In the end, the strait remained firmly in Ottoman hands, and the Allies were forced into the costly decision of sending troops ashore. Looking back, it's clear the naval fiasco wasn't just about mines and guns. It was about a failure to respect the enemy and the terrain. The strait was never going to be easy to take, no matter how many battleships were thrown at it. But the planners refused to see this, blinded by overconfidence. And that overconfidence cost thousands of lives, 3 battleships, and any hope of a quick victory. This disaster was only the beginning. The failure at sea would soon be followed by an even greater nightmare on land, where soldiers from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand would find themselves fighting and dying on the harsh cliffs and beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. What began as a bold naval gamble had turned into a blood-soaked stalemate that would haunt nations for generations. When the naval assault failed, the Allies faced a choice: abandon the Gallipoli plan or double down. Pride and politics won out. Instead of admitting defeat, they sent men ashore. On April 25, 1915, tens of thousands of soldiers from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. What followed was one of the most brutal and hopeless campaigns of the entire war. The plan seemed simple in London and Paris. The Allies would land on the beaches, push inland, seize the high ridges, and knock out the Ottoman guns that made the Dardanelles impossible to force. But the geography of Gallipoli made this easier said than done. The peninsula was a fortress in itself: steep cliffs, narrow beaches, deep gullies, and ridges that gave defenders clear lines of fire. The Ottomans, commanded by men like Mustafa Kemal, knew exactly where the Allies had to land and prepared for them. The landings turned into massacres almost immediately. At Cape Helles, British and French troops were poured onto narrow strips of sand under a hail of bullets. Machine guns raked the beaches, and artillery pounded the landing craft before men could even reach shore. Some units lost entire companies in minutes, their bodies left floating in the surf or sprawled in the sand. Those who survived scrambled for cover behind dunes or piles of the dead, unable to move forward and terrified to fall back. For the Australians and New Zealanders, who landed at what became known as Anzac Cove, the experience was just as horrific. Their boats grounded on a stretch of coast where cliffs rose straight up from the beach. The soldiers charged forward, but were cut down almost instantly by fire from above. The cliffs were so steep that even unopposed, they would have been hard to climb. But with Ottoman rifles firing down on them, it became nearly impossible. Somehow, a foothold was established. But it was no victory, just the beginning of a desperate fight to hold ground measured in yards. One soldier later wrote that the beach was a slaughterhouse, with the sea running red and the cries of the wounded echoing between the cliffs. Another described bodies piled so high that men used them as sandbags against the incoming fire. These weren't exaggerations. The landing zones became charnel houses where death came from every direction: bullets, shells, bayonets, and the very terrain itself. The Allies had expected quick progress. Instead, within days, it was clear they were bogged down. The Ottomans led with determination and discipline, fought ferociously to hold every ridge and trench. Mustafa Kemal, who would later become known as Ataturk, famously told his men, "I am not ordering you to fight. I am ordering you to die." His soldiers did exactly that, hurling themselves into counterattacks that forced the Allies back toward the beaches. The cliffs became killing grounds, and every attempt to push inland was met with devastating resistance. Trench warfare soon replaced the initial chaos. The Gallipoli Peninsula began to look like a smaller, harsher version of the Western Front. Trenches were dug within yards of each other, so close that soldiers could hear the enemy coughing, talking, and even praying. Between the lines lay no man's land, a narrow strip where any movement in daylight meant certain death. Snipers made sure that even the simple act of lifting one's head above the parapet could be fatal. The conditions in the trenches were unbearable. The heat in summer baked the land until the earth cracked and dust choked the air. In winter, rain flooded the trenches, and men stood for days in knee-deep water, their feet rotting into what became known as trench foot. Corpses lay unburied between the lines, sometimes for weeks, the stench of decay drifting over both sides. Flies swarmed so thickly that soldiers joked you could scoop them up by the handful, though nobody laughed for long. Dysentery and typhoid ripped through the ranks, felling more men than bullets. Food was scarce and often rotten, with soldiers surviving on hard biscuits infested with weevils. Every attempt to break the stalemate ended in more bloodshed. In August 1915, the Allies launched fresh assaults at Suvla Bay and on the ridges above Anzac Cove. Once again, the landings were poorly planned and poorly executed. At Suvla, British troops waded ashore almost unopposed, but instead of pushing inland, they hesitated. By the time orders were sorted and advances made, the Ottomans had rushed reinforcements to the high ground. Within days, the chance for a breakthrough was gone. The battles for the ridges became nightmarish contests of endurance. Men charged uphill against machine gun fire, sometimes gaining ground, often losing it, always at terrible cost. At Chunuk Bair, New Zealand troops briefly seized a key peak, only to be driven off by relentless Ottoman counterattacks. The survivors described bayonet fighting so close that soldiers could feel the breath of the enemy on their faces. By the end, the ridges were littered with bodies, and the lines had barely moved. For the soldiers, the suffering seemed endless. Letters home spoke of fear, exhaustion, and despair. One Australian wrote to his family that the nights were the worst. "We lie listening to the cries of the wounded in no man's land, and we can do nothing. Anyone who tries to go out to help is cut down." Another described the smell of death as something that never left the nose, even after weeks at sea. Medical care was overwhelmed. Field hospitals overflowed with the wounded, many of whom lay untreated for hours or days. Amputations were performed with minimal anesthesia, and gangrene was common. Disease spread through the camps faster than doctors could treat it. Men who had survived bullets and shells often died from infection or exhaustion. The toll on morale was severe. What had been sold as a quick campaign turned into a nightmare with no end in sight. Soldiers felt abandoned, trapped on a barren peninsula where death seemed inevitable. Desertions grew, though many had nowhere to go. Some men broke down entirely, their minds shattered by the constant shelling and the endless sight of blood. What we now call shell shock was rampant, though in those days it was dismissed as weakness. The Ottoman soldiers suffered just as much, if not more. Their supplies were limited, their medical services primitive, and their losses staggering. But unlike the Allies, they were defending their homeland, and this gave them a fierce determination. Accounts from the Ottoman side describe men fighting until their ammunition ran out, then charging with bayonets, unwilling to yield an inch of ground. By the end of 1915, the Gallipoli land campaign had settled into a stalemate of unimaginable suffering. Tens of thousands of men on both sides were dead, and countless more were maimed or sick. The beaches were clogged with wreckage, and the trenches had become open graves. All the while, the strategic goal, the capture of the Dardanelles, remained, as far away as ever. What began as a bold plan for a quick victory had turned into one of the most futile slaughters of the Great War. And yet, despite the suffering, the Allies continued to pour men and resources into the campaign, unwilling to admit failure. The soldiers on the ground paid the price for this pride, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The Gallipoli landings were meant to bring glory. Instead, they brought only blood, mud, and misery. It was here, on these beaches and ridges, that entire nations would carry scars that would last for generations. The Gallipoli campaign dragged on for 9 long months, and in the end, it left behind nothing but ruin, grief, and bitterness. For the Allies, it was not only a defeat on the battlefield, but also a political disaster that reshaped the way people viewed the war back home. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a costly but defining moment, one that would later be tied to the rise of a national hero. But before we reach that legacy, we have to look squarely at the human cost of this failed invasion, because that's where the true weight of the Gallipoli story rests. From the beginning, soldiers endured conditions that were almost beyond human endurance. Once the Allies realized that a quick victory wasn't possible, the campaign settled into a brutal stalemate. Trenches were dug into rocky ground, often just yards from the enemy's own lines. Soldiers lived for weeks in narrow, muddy ditches filled with lice, flies, and the constant stench of unburied corpses. Food supplies were limited, and what was available often spoiled in the heat. Fresh water was scarce, forcing men to ration every sip while sweating under the relentless Mediterranean sun. Disease spread as quickly as bullets. Dysentery spread through contaminated water, and poor sanitation tore through the ranks, leaving men too weak to fight. Flies swarmed over the trenches, carrying filth from latrines into food supplies. Medical care lagged far behind the needs of the battlefield, with makeshift hospitals overwhelmed and bandages reused until they were little more than rags. For many soldiers, the greatest threat wasn't a bullet or shellette, was infection, fever, and starvation. Yet the battles themselves were no less horrific. Each attempt to push inland ended in disaster. The terrain gave the Ottoman defenders the advantage: steep cliffs, narrow ravines, and high ridges that allowed machine gunners and artillery crews to cut down attackers before they even left the beaches. A single charge across open ground could leave hundreds dead in minutes. Survivors described the beaches littered with bodies, the cries of the wounded echoing through the night. Soldiers had to crawl over the fallen to keep advancing, only to be cut down themselves. The toll on the Ottoman side was equally severe. Defending their homeland gave them fierce determination, but they faced the same hunger, thirst, and disease as their enemies. Their trenches, dug into unforgiving terrain, often collapsed under shell fire, burying men alive. Ammunition shortages forced soldiers to ration bullets, while artillery crews sometimes had only a handful of shells to fire each day. They too endured swarms of flies, outbreaks of typhus, and the constant drumbeat of death. By the end of the campaign, the numbers told a story of devastation. The Allies lost an estimated 130,000 men, either killed outright or wounded so badly that they were permanently disabled. The Ottomans lost more than 86,000 soldiers. These are statistics, but behind each number was a life: a farmer from New Zealand, a dock worker from Liverpool, a young man from Anatolia, a French conscript who had never seen the sea before this campaign. Families across Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and the Ottoman Empire mourned their sons, husbands, and fathers. The psychological toll was just as deep. Survivors carried home memories they could never shake. Soldiers wrote in their diaries about friends dying in their arms, about nightmares of shells exploding, about the endless sound of flies buzzing over the dead. Letters home described the beaches as slaughter yards and the trenches as hell carved into the earth. The horror of Gallipoli left entire generations scarred, not only physically, but emotionally. Back in Britain, the scale of the losses created outrage. What was sold as a bold plan turned out to be a blunder that wasted lives on a scale no one could ignore. Winston Churchill, who had championed the campaign, was forced to resign from his position as First Lord of the Admiralty. He later returned to politics, but Gallipoli haunted his career for decades. For the public, especially those who had lost loved ones, the campaign became a symbol of incompetence and arrogance at the highest levels of leadership. In Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became something else entirely. The losses were staggering for young nations that had never fought in such a large conflict before. The soldiers who landed at Anzac Cove, many of them teenagers, were thrown into a nightmare that shaped the identity of both countries. The day of the landing, April 25th, became known as Anzac Day, a national day of remembrance still honored every year. The campaign was seen not just as a tragedy, but as a defining moment of national character. Forged through shared suffering and sacrifice, for the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli became a rare victory in a war that otherwise led to collapse. The successful defense of the peninsula elevated commanders like Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who would go on to lead the Turkish War of Independence and found the modern Republic of Turkey. But that future came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands of Ottoman families buried their sons, and the countryside was left scarred with graves and battle debris. The evacuation of Allied troops in December 1915 and January 1916 marked the final humiliation. Ironically, the withdrawal was one of the few parts of the campaign executed with skill, completed with minimal casualties. But that only underscored how badly the rest of the operation had been handled. After 9 months of slaughter, nothing had been gained. The Allies never reached Constantinople. The sea route to Russia remained blocked, and the beaches of Gallipoli remained soaked with the blood of soldiers from both sides. It's hard to grasp the true weight of Gallipoli without picturing what daily life was like for the men trapped there. Imagine standing ankle-deep in mud, your stomach empty, your body feverish from dysentery, while shells explode overhead. Imagine carrying a wounded comrade down a ravine under sniper fire, knowing you may never make it back yourself. Imagine writing a letter home, trying to hide the horror so your mother or wife wouldn't worry. Even as you heard the screams of the dying, only a few feet away, that was Gallipoli not, a daring gamble, not a glorious charge, but a drawn-out nightmare. The campaign was more than a failure of strategy. It was a human tragedy measured in graves and broken lives. Every side left Gallipoli carrying scars that would never fully heal. And even though the fighting ended in 1916, the memory of those 9 months would haunt nations for generations, shaping how they remembered the war, their leaders, and themselves. The Gallipoli campaign was a failure in almost every military sense. The Allies failed to capture the Dardanelles, failed to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and failed to achieve the strategic goals that Winston Churchill and others had promised would change the course of World War I. Yet, despite the disaster, Gallipoli left behind something far greater than a battlefield defeat. It carved its place into the hearts of nations, shaping how they saw themselves and how they remembered their dead. What began as a flawed invasion ended as a defining chapter in national identity, especially for Australia and New Zealand. When young men from both countries boarded ships in 1915, many of them had never left home. They were farm boys, miners, dock workers, teachers, and clerks, filled with excitement, fear, and the sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. They landed on the beaches of Gallipoli under machine gun fire, scrambling up cliffs while their comrades fell beside them. What followed was 9 months of hardship that tested every ounce of their endurance. These men were not professional soldiers. They were citizens thrown into the chaos of a world war. Yet they fought with a spirit that surprised both their allies and their enemies. The idea of the Anzac spirit was born here. It wasn't about winning battles or holding ground. It was about courage when the odds were hopeless. It was about looking after a wounded friend when doing so could get you killed. It was about enduring hunger, thirst, and disease without breaking down. This spirit became part of the way Australians and New Zealanders saw themselves, and it carried far beyond the battlefield. It meant resilience in the face of disaster, loyalty to one another, and a kind of quiet toughness that set them apart. Anzac Day, marked on April 25th each year, became the way both nations remembered Gallipoli. At dawn, people gather for services that mirror the time the soldiers first landed on the beaches. The silence, the bugle call, and the reading of names remind every generation of the price paid in those far-off trenches. For families who lost sons, brothers, or fathers, it was a day of mourning. For the nations as a whole, it became a day of unity. Even now, over a century later, the day is not about glorifying war, it is about remembering the men who fought and died in one of history's greatest military blunders and finding pride in their sacrifice. The legacy of Gallipoli also stretched to the Ottoman side. For the empire, which was already straining under the weight of war, the successful defense of Gallipoli was a rare triumph. It gave hope to soldiers and civilians who had endured years of hardship. More importantly, it brought a young officer named Mustafa Kemal to the forefront. His leadership at Gallipoli, where he famously told his men, "I am not ordering you to attack, I am ordering you to die," turned him into a national hero. After the war, he would lead Turkey's War of Independence and found the modern Republic of Turkey. Without Gallipoli, his rise might never have happened. In Britain, the campaign left a far darker shadow. Families who had been told their sons were fighting for a decisive victory instead received telegrams telling them their loved ones had died for nothing. Public anger forced resignations, including Winston Churchill's, and Gallipoli became a symbol of wasted lives and poor leadership. The soldiers themselves were remembered for their bravery, but the campaign stood as a warning of what happened when bold plans ignored the harsh realities of war. The memory of Gallipoli has never been simple. On one side, it is remembered as a story of courage, sacrifice, and endurance. On the other, it is a reminder of arrogance, miscalculation, and the devastating human cost of war. This dual legacy has kept the story alive for over a century. For Australia and New Zealand, it became a cornerstone of nationhood. For Turkey, it became proof of resilience in defending their homeland. For Britain, it became a painful lesson written in blood. What makes Gallipoli so powerful even today is the way ordinary soldiers are remembered. They were not generals drawing lines on maps. They were young men trying to survive in conditions that defy imagination. Picture a soldier from the Australian outback, lying in a trench carved into rocky ground, swatting at flies while clutching a letter from home. Or a New Zealand farm boy, no older than 19, dragging a wounded comrade back to safety under machine gun fire. Or a Turkish soldier, rationing his last few bullets, praying that reinforcements would come before the next attack. Their stories, repeated across generations, became the heart of the Gallipoli legacy. Even today, thousands of people travel to the Gallipoli Peninsula to walk the beaches and stand in the cemeteries. The cliffs and ridges that once rang with gunfire are now silent, covered with grass and wildflowers. Memorials mark the spots where men from both sides fell. At Anzac Cove, at Lone Pine, at Chunuk Bair, people gather to read the names carved into stone. Turkish memorials honor their dead with equal reverence. The site has become not only a symbol of national pride, but also a place of shared remembrance, where former enemies are honored side by side. The Gallipoli Campaign shows how failure on the battlefield can still shape nations in profound ways. It reminds us that history is not only about victories. Sometimes it is the defeats, the ones that test a nation's will, that break families, that leave scars that define identity most deeply. The men who fought and died at Gallipoli may not have achieved the goals set by their leaders, but their memory became something larger, something that continues to bind generations together. The story of Gallipoli is not only about strategy or numbers, it is about people, about ordinary men thrown into extraordinary circumstances, whose bravery outlasted the blunders of those in command. Their sacrifice became the foundation of remembrance in Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey, and a cautionary tale for Britain. That is why, even today, over a century later, Gallipoli is still spoken of with reverence and pain. If you've stayed with me through this story of blunders, bravery, and the birth of national identity, then UVA walked through one of the most defining and tragic episodes of the First World War. The Gallipoli Campaign may have ended in failure, but its legacy continues to live on in the hearts and histories of nations. For more stories that cut through the myths and bring you face to face with history, Raw Truths, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world.